Mark, I really appreciate you joining me. Just for the record, can you spell your first and last name for me?
Sure. My name is Marc Klaas. That's Marcklaas, and I am the founder of the Klaas Kids Foundation.
Tell me a little bit about the foundation.
Well, the Klaas Kids Foundation was formed in 1994 in the aftermath of the kidnap, rape, and murder of my daughter, Polly Klaas. We started the foundation to give meaning to her death and also to hopefully protect other children that might find themselves in her situation or similar situations. So our mission statement is to stop crimes against children.
And for our story, what capacity, what credentials would you like to be addressed as?
Just as the founder of the foundation.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So before we dive into the situation out here in Kern County with the two missing boys, 3-year-old Orson and 4-year-old Oren West, can you give me a little bit of context of uh, how your family was struck with such a tragedy as well?
Well, sure. It was on the evening of October 1st, 1993, that my 12-year-old daughter, Polly, was hosting a slumber party in the home that she shared with her mother in Petaluma, California. She was hosting the party with two of her girlfriends. And at about 10:30 at night, as the girls were going to prepare to go to bed, Polly opened the bedroom door and there was a knife-wielding stranger standing there. And he said, "If you make a noise, I'll slit your throats." He then proceeded to tie, bind, and gag Polly's girlfriends and basically steal Polly into the night. Her last words were, "Please don't hurt my mother and sister," who happened to be sleeping in the next bedroom. And it took the girls about 15 minutes to extricate themselves. They contacted law enforcement, and that launched a 65-day investigation into what happened to Polly. And we found ultimately that she had been taken by a recently released serial predator named Richard Allen Davis, who in fact had been released from prison for his second kidnapping 3 months before she disappeared. And that character now resides on California's death row. Not that that means anything at this point.
And since then, from my understanding, you've dedicated your life to you made a huge transition in your life from the business you were operating to
Mhm.
the front of missing children and policies around that. Can you explain your journey a little bit to me?
Well, it's a pretty hard journey to explain, but basically, I found as we were looking for Polly during those 65 days that I was provided with very good information from law enforcement, that I had turned myself into an effective advocate for missing children, and really realized that there was nobody else doing that job in society, at least nobody that had any kind of a profile that was getting the attention of uh, anybody that cared or mattered. So with the support of my wife, um, I launched into that, starting the Klaas Kids Foundation, and got very fortunate. I mean, goodness, I was able to visit the White House on numerous occasions. You know, we became well known to the president, President Clinton at that time. Worked with a lot of governors around the country. First pursuing things like Megan's Law, Megan's Law being the sex offender registry that gives the public information about those individuals that live in their neighborhoods, then ultimately into the Amber Alert and various other pieces of legislation that I think really worked to protect children from the predators that were in existence then. And we then started on an internet campaign. We started a search and rescue team, which is still very viable. In fact, we just had our busiest year in search and rescue in 2020, which goes against the grain. I mean, nothing seemed to happen in 2020 except COVID, but still there were a lot of kids that were being reported missing. And so we're 27 years into this experiment right now, and still going strong.
And I think your experience and your advocacy, as seen, across all media, a lot of media platforms have had a lot of has influenced a lot of positive change when it comes to policy
Well, thank
and
you.
efforts to make sure that these type of things uh, are, I mean, from all fronts. organized in the search, that there, Megan's law, that there's a database for sex offenders. I understand there's the three strikes rule also followed uh,
Mhm.
the situation. Was that directly related um,
To Polly and
yeah.
our crime? Well, in a way it was. I mean, it was the three strikes movement was started by a guy named Mike Reynolds in Fresno. And Mike started the three strikes movement after the murder of his daughter in Fresno back in 1992. It was really getting absolutely no traction, though, until we found out what had happened to Polly, because the contrast was so great. I mean, a sweet little girl in her own home, minding her own business, was invaded by a monster who never should have been out on the street. And when people made that connection, the three strikes petition absolutely took off, and it got millions of signatures. Every politician in the state got behind three strikes. And by February of 1994, 2 months after Polly was kidnapped, it had been passed into law by the legislature. And that November, it was passed in the law by a petition. Anyway, it was passed in the law by the people. And throughout the 10 or 15 years, I think that three strikes was really effective. It really totally helped to reduce crime in the state of California, both violent crime and property crime, by about 50%. So it was a very good law, a very effective law, and one that has been misrepresented by politicians ever since. And unfortunately, now it's just sort of a shadow of what it really was.
And since what happened to Polly, you've spoken to a lot of different families who've experienced their children and their loved ones going missing. And you've delved yourself into a lot of communities that have been struck by this tragedy as well. In California City, there's two missing boys that you and I have spoken about in the past on the Nancy Gray show.
Yeah.
3-year-old Orson, 4-year-old Orrin West, they disappeared from their backyard, according to their adoptive parents. And you know some of the details of this case. What do you make of it?
Well, it doesn't make a lot of sense. First of all, this type of abduction, the type of abduction that Polly went through, a stereotypical stranger abduction, is very, very rare. Less than 1% of all abductions occur this way. But then when you break it down into two little children as opposed to one little child, you've got double the trouble. Whoever's got the kids is going to have to somehow or another mollify two children and keep two children under control as opposed to one child. And I think we all understand when children are that young, it's not easy to do that. And then what's the motive? Why in the world would somebody take these kids? I mean, if you start breaking this down, you're going to probably find a small subsection of uh, possible individuals who were involved. In other words, it's not a community that people come in and out of a lot. It's not a community that strangers actually go to. It's a remote community and a small community that's got a very finite population. And one would have to look towards that population, I believe, in order to solve this mystery.
Uh, and you were telling me a little bit about the aftermath of the investigation immediately following Polly going missing. We know that in this case, the California City Police Department asked the adoptive parents and many others close to the investigation to submit to a polygraph. The police chief of the California City Police Department didn't tell me whether they actually took the test or not. But there are no suspects named. There are no persons of interest. But with that, in your experience, being the father of Polly Klaas, were you also asked to submit to a polygraph? What was that experience like?
Well, first of all, I was as upfront with law enforcement as I could be from the very beginning. I made a very conscious decision not to get an attorney involved because I wanted to be able to be a spokesperson for myself and for my child. And they told me up front that in the vast majority of these kinds of cases, family members are involved. And the best way I can serve Polly's situation is to clear myself from suspicion. And I told them that whatever it would take to do that, they could interrogate me as long as they wanted about anything they wanted. They could give me a polygraph, which they ultimately did. And I was able to eliminate myself early enough so that they could then take the vast resource. And when the FBI comes into a case, it does bring vast resource and knowledge with it. So they could then take that and direct it into other areas. They could focus on other family members, perhaps. They could focus on friends and acquaintances of the family. They could focus on the registered sex offenders that lived within the community, who the public was not aware of at that time, only that there were some of these shady people out there somewhere. And so that they could even take a look at people that made deliveries to the home, the mailman, anybody that could have some kind of a tangential relationship with these kids one way or another. And then hopefully they continue to eliminate and eliminate and eliminate until they finally found the guy that actually committed the crime. All of that makes great sense in theory. But if you're dealing with a true stranger abduction, it's going to be very, very difficult, short of finding the child or finding some, very specific evidence to make the case one way or other as to what had happened to that child. I think we were fortunate because after 2 months, somebody wandered upon a crime scene on property that they owned, and that ultimately resulted in figuring out who had taken Polly, going and making the arrest on that individual, and ultimately recovering Polly's remains. So I guess the short answer is you listen to the cops, you do as many media interviews as you can possibly do, get people invested in the case, get people to understand and know the children, so that all eyes are out there looking for the kids. And with some luck and some great investigation, they'll be able to bring a resolution, whatever that may be.
So in your journey, you've noticed, in your experience, I should say, that one of the rules of thumb when your kids go missing is to do as many media interviews as possible. Is that true?
Well, I believe that's true. And I also believe that the people that should be doing those interviews are family members, are the parents of the missing kids, because they're the ones that are going to be able to get out there, make the best case, get people to understand who these children were, share information about the children, and hopefully enlist the public in being invested in bringing the kids home. Now, I know in a lot of cases, the parents may not speak very good English, or they may have other barriers that they're dealing with. So somebody else might come in and be a spokesperson on behalf of the family. But I always believe that the family is the best resource in these kinds of situations.
Got it. Now, if I could just ask, it was more than 60 days it took to find out exactly what happened to Polly.
Yeah.
It's been about 4 weeks so far, excuse me, 8 weeks since the disappearance of the two toddler brothers here in Kern County. Um, every day that goes by, there's a little more tension in the community. They want to know what happened. They want to have at least a glimpse of the investigation from the police department. Um, can you talk about um, the investigation that you experienced? Was information from authorities passed along to you throughout the way, or how much stuff was happening, especially with the FBI, that you didn't know about until after you guys found Polly?
Well, I knew that they were out there. I mean, I knew that there were a lot of cops out there, and FBI agents out there looking for Polly. They told me a couple of things. I already mentioned one. They told me that the best thing I could do was cooperate and eliminate myself as a possible suspect. But they also told me, and I think this is kind of key, at least it was in my case, that any case-related information, investigative information, would be relayed to me by law enforcement before I ever heard it on the media. And they were very true to that. They were very good about that. But that doesn't mean they were releasing anything. I mean, literally, when you're investigating a case where you don't know who the suspect is, then it's going to create rumors. It's going to hamper the investigation itself because you're really kind of blindly reaching out, hoping that something will click and something will bring this whole thing together. So we would go days and even weeks without any new information on Polly's case. And in fact, quite truthfully, and in Polly's situation, it took 65 days before they were able to solve it. And that was by happenstance. It was because somebody found a crime scene on their property and they were able to make the correct connections and bring it to a resolution. Had that person not found that crime scene, we still wouldn't know what happened to Polly. So it becomes a very frustrating exercise. You have family members that are worried sick, that are doing everything in our case that we could to keep the story alive so that law enforcement would have a full investigative unit on it until the case was cracked. So that put them in a difficult place. It put us in a difficult place. It put the media in a difficult place, because how do you report on a story day after day after day and say, well, there's nothing new to report on this story? I mean, it's so terribly frustrating for absolutely everybody involved. But for us, the police were very good about giving us case information. I understand that they didn't want to screw up the investigation in any way. They didn't want to reveal things that may not be true or that hadn't been proven correct so far. But still, it leads you down a rat hole, quite frankly, and you wonder if it's something you'll ever be able to get out of.
And after basically everything was crossed off the list and you guys ultimately found out what happened to Polly, were there parts of the investigation that were then revealed to you on what was happening behind the scenes that you may not have been aware of?
Well, some things, sure. I mean, I became friends with many of the law enforcement individuals involved, and they had a couple of suspects at different times. There was some guy that had tried to commit a similar kind of crime that was kind of bushy haired and everything, who they were very, very hot on for a while, but that individual proved to be nothing. There was an extortion attempt. There was some guy who said he'd let Polly go if they gave him $10,000. There's all kinds of things going on in the background. You've got the psychics are just everywhere. It's awful, and they're all telling you the same story basically, hoping that they can somehow get a handle on that reward if and when the case is ever cracked. But it's a cesspool. It's a cesspool for absolutely everyone involved, and the sooner that it can be the sooner it can be solved, the better off for everybody. Which again is why mom and dad, whether they're biological or whether they're step parents, should be in the middle of this thing. They should be talking to the police. They should be talking to the media. They should be talking to the public, and they should be doing everything they can to make the case that those boys are viable, valuable, and need to be found.
Certainly. You're talking about reward money. What was it back then for Pauline? I know you adjust for inflation, but I know now there's a more than $120,000 in reward money out there for the two missing boys here, and it's generated a lot of tips to the California City Police Department. They say they've gotten over 2,000 tips, but they said there hasn't been a single credible one. Is that kind of what you guys realized with the reward money for Polly? Was there just a lot of people coming forward, but nothing really panned out?
Yeah, the FBI was dealing with a new kind of computer system back in '93. It was called Rapid Start, and what it did is it helped them to sort out the various tips. Is it a hot tip? Is it a cold tip? But when you start putting loads of money out there for the public, you're going to get people that are going to try and grab that piece, like I mentioned just a few moments ago with the psychics. Now, there's basically two kinds of rewards. There's a reward for the recovery, the safe recovery of the child, and then there's a reward for information leading to the arrest and prosecution of the individual that is responsible for having committed the crime against the child. And so depending on which kind of a reward they have out there, or maybe there's a couple of rewards, you're going to get people, focused on those different kinds of things. Now, they'll get thousands of tips. They'll get a tip like, we were driving down Highway 4 and we saw a car coming the other way that had two young black boys in the back seat, and we think it's them. Well, there's nothing that can be done with anything like that. It's just a quick sighting, and it's just based on your desire to help and hope that maybe you can help bring a resolution to this thing. And then there are the much more the much more realistic types of tips that people actually saw the kids in a certain place, or took pictures of the kids, or heard somebody talking about the kids, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the reward thing is tough, man. It's really tough. We were very fortunate in our case. The actress Winona Ryder, who actually came from Petaluma, California, came forth. She went to the FBI and said that she wanted to give $1 million reward. Well, they said, if you do that, we're going to be inundated with these tips. And so they ultimately decided upon a $200,000 reward. But still, there were so many people from all over the country that were calling, that were contacting law enforcement, that it overwhelmed. It had just overwhelmed the investigative force. They just, they'd go out in the morning and have to debunk 3 or 4 of these tips every day, and so it just goes on and on and on. It's brutal.
And I know that you guys had, that $1,200,000 reward you mentioned was for Polly, right? Okay. For out here in California City, like I said, there, is $120,000 reward. California City Police Department are dealing with numerous tips a day. And they have said they've, allocated a lot of resources to have to, document the tip, go out there, follow through to cross it off the list. So they've been doing that daily here. I want to share some of the circumstances of this case to see just kind of what your thoughts are. So with any missing persons case, you always start closest to who saw them first, start talking to family, and then work your way out. Well, there's been a lot of investigative pieces that have happened at the house. We're talking, they brought search dogs in the home, and they found the scent of the boys inside the home, but not outside the home. They brought cadaver dogs into the home. They issued a search warrant, took the adoptive parents' cell phones, which have still since been returned. They tested the car with luminol, the parents' car. They dug up the whole backyard. They didn't find anything there. They brought imaging services, imaging devices to shoot even deeper into the ground to see if the boys were there. And so far, as what we know in the media, there has been no sign of them in that area.
I mean, it's obvious. It's obvious that they're looking very, very close to home. That if they're not putting their full investigative resource into the family itself, they're certainly putting a large amount of that resource into the family themselves. And that if 8 weeks later, that kind of activity is still going on and the family has not been able to extricate themselves from suspicion, then they got a lot of splaining to do, don't they?
Well, there's been a lot of, web sleuths and people out there who have been coming up with their own conclusions. But I know that the community is incredibly frustrated, wondering why, it's been 8 weeks and there hasn't been any, hard hitting physical evidence showing what happened to these guys. The police department said, hey, we don't have a single piece of physical evidence that shows any kind of foul play happened.
Well, I mean, first of all, we're talking about 2 tiny little children, and it's a big world out there. If somebody wants to get rid of 2 tiny little bodies, I suspect there's certainly many ways to do that. But it almost seems like one of 2 things happened. I mean, either, as the family says, somebody inexplicably took those 2 little boys, or that didn't happen. And that means they've got 2 worlds to search the world of the family and then the larger world itself. And as long as indications keep pointing at the world of the family, law enforcement will continue to focus on that world. As I said, I think I've said this a couple of times, until you eliminate yourself from suspicion. And if you don't or are unable to limit yourself from suspicion, then you become the focus of investigation, you become the focus of rumor, you you find yourself in a position that is very difficult to get out of.
It's also important to mention that families are usually looked at in these cases, right? Like usually the big misconception is, hey, it must have been the parents or it must have been. So it's a difficult element to balance out, I would say, for the public, because you see time and time again, um, you know, the rumors that surround any case directed at the parents or a sibling or extended family member. So I think that's kind of the balance of what I've been seeing happen, at least involving this case. There have been some family members that have shied away from talking because they've been getting threats. They've been already been portrayed by a lot of people out there to have been directly involved in some way. What is your advice to that? Because I know you went through
Yeah, I went through that. I mean, people said that about me. There were stories that were going to be published about me. There were a lot of rumors about me, but I told everybody in my family, I told everybody that I knew that we had to pursue the truth, that there's only one way to finish this, and that's to find out what actually happened and to be true to that idea. And that if we were, we would, I thought naively at the time, we would be able to get our child back home alive. Um, Before I understood the true nature of evil, I guess. So, so that would be my advice to everybody, is to pursue the truth. And if you pursue the truth, then the answers you get will be real answers, if you get answers at all.
Mark, it's really been a pleasure having you on here with me. I really, really appreciate it.
Sure.
And we'll definitely be in contact moving forward.
Let me know how it goes, okay?
We'll do.